All right, since it's 2:30, we'll get going with our next presentation from George. So George here is going to speak on WASCoBs and reducing soil erosion. So George is a professional engineer at Spriet Associates of London, specializing in stormwater management and the Drainage Act. George has been working in the field since 2010 and grew up working on a farrow to finish swine operation. Growing up in Middlesex County has left George with a passion for agriculture, which he is able to incorporate in his work to better serve rural communities. Spriet Associates has been providing services to municipalities, including reports under the Drainage Act since 1961. So welcome, George.
Thank you. I'm just going to open up my presentation here. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, can hear you and now can see your presentation.
Excellent. So thank you for this opportunity to talk about this. We've been doing a lot of projects under the Drainage Act recently with WASCoBs Incorporated, and this is something that we see as a huge benefit to the agricultural community and to soil erosion. So this is a wonderful opportunity. I guess I'll get started by talking about what a WASCoB is. We have this first picture here. This is a project that we've recently completed a municipal drain on. This was before we had started the project. This is a no-till farming operation here, which was experiencing extreme erosion through it. It was not a particularly large watershed in the area of 150 acres, but it was steep grades and soils that were lighter than some other areas, and we started to see this gully-like erosion channel form. We're seeing this more and more on projects, and this is something that farmers are looking to address under the Drainage Act, which it comes more from, installing bigger drains does help with this, but it needs to be a bigger picture approach to solve these problems. So WASCoBs are water and sediment control basins. They're constructed on the surface to retain water after large storms and release it in a slow and controlled manner. Typically, for our projects, they're released into a municipal drainage outlet, but some private landowners have also completed these projects where they're putting them into their own private headers or private tiling systems. So there's many different types of designs for these types of systems, but the three most common that we see are narrow grass berms. So these would be typically quite tall, depends on the topography, but they would be tall, as narrow as possible to have limited interference with cropping operations, and would be grassed to stop them from eroding with time. There's wide workable berms, which are significantly more costly to construct, but they don't take away from the workability of the farm. And then also on occasion where you don't have the topography to support creating berms, sometimes depressions are created instead, meaning that in low-lying lands we're excavating further down to store runoff. The primary purpose is to capture that stormwater runoff and provide stormwater management to these rural watersheds. This will break up the greater watersheds into smaller little watersheds, so you don't have these large overland flows forming, causing soil erosion. And also it stops these peak flows, it attenuates these peak flows so that the downstream properties are not seeing the huge flows through them as well. So the stormwater detention allows for the soil particles to settle too. So instead of having overland flows continue down the channels when I say channels, I'm talking over the field channels, like we experienced in the first photo there, which have enough velocity to carry soil particles. The water hits these retentions, these control basins, and they're slowed down enough that the soil particles actually start to settle out and are captured within these sediment basins. They're very cost effective and practical. Some of these are a couple $1,000s compared to a standard catch basin inlet. So it is quite cost effective. There's also other benefits, but we'll get into those later. The first, way to construct these is by narrow grass berms. We have an example of one we constructed on the right over here. It can be seen, it's been constructed along a property line / fence row, so it has very limited interference with the cropping operations, but it still provides benefits. Under a large rain event, we would expect this area where all the topsoil has been stripped. This was prior to redistributing topsoil, but all this area here that's been disturbed would, retain water. And then it would be slowly released through a Higginbottom. This, has the benefits of slowing down the water, putting it in the tile, and also allowing the sediment to filter out. Here's an example of a workable berm here. It's hard to capture in a photo because the slopes are so gentle. But it's an example of one in a field in that way. It's not interfering at all with the cropping operation. We see some preference for farmers to try to construct these, but it's much more difficult for them to be as effective, and also for it to be cost effective. You're moving a significant amount of earth to try to taper this into the earth, as compared to something like this first example, where you're taking the natural topography along a property line or something. It could be a laneway. Sometimes we've actually done them just with the direction that the field is cropped. Therefore, having limited interference, it's not as nice as having it along a fence line, but it still limits the amount of interference and provides the benefits. So this would be an example, like I said, of broad-crested. It's not perfect, but from a cost perspective, but it's a compromise between workability and benefits. So, there's two options we see for these type of watersheds from our perspective, of dealing with runoff. And it's, the two main options we see are WASCoBs or grass waterways. There's many benefits of WASCoBs versus grass waterways, but the first one that comes to mind is maintenance. Over time, I've seen this with a lot of older grass waterways. We see the water starting to exit the grass waterway as well. Over time, sediment builds up in the grass waterway, and then over time, the water actually exits the grass waterway and runs adjacent and starts that erosion process again. So the nice thing about a WASCoB is that you're actually stopping the water at the source rather than trying to control it. So you're trying to attenuate peak flows, trying to capture it in isolated spots rather than trying to control the way it travels through the land. Again, like I said earlier, these can be implemented very easily into existing features, laneways, woodlot limits, property lines. And this allows us to have minimal impact farming operation, which compared to grass waterways is a very preferable option for landowners. The problem with grass waterways is they take a lot of land and they also kind of break up land. We've been able to completely eliminate them on projects by creating WASCoBs to replace them. And from our perspective, you're doing a better job of capturing sediment, and you're also attenuating the flows so that they're having less impacts downstream as well. So it is an opportunity for everybody to benefit, but however, topography has to support it. Sometimes a grass waterway is a better solution, especially when you get to flatter grades, if there are erosion concerns there. So we've been completing them under the Drainage Act mostly. Right now we're currently completing, I would say, 5 to 10 projects a year, roughly. And we've been doing that for the last 3 years. We've been currently designing our WASCoBs to retain storms up to a 10-year storm event. So a 10-year storm event is the largest storm you'd expect to see on a frequency of once every 10 years. To give it a rough approximation of what that would be approximately 2.5 inches of rain in a very short duration, or 4 or 5 inches over a long duration. So it's not the largest design standard, but it does handle the great majority of our storms. It would be expected to be exceeded, you know, every 10 years or so. It's not going to capture every rain event, but even when it is exceeded, it's capturing a lot of that rain up to that 10-year level. So if you have, you know, a storm that's slightly larger than a 10-year, at least you've captured 80%. During a 100-year storm event, no, it's not going to do as much as you'd like, but it's still is going to lower that amount of runoff. The Drainage Act is an excellent tool for constructing these. It allows us to create it for the whole watershed. You know, sometimes not everybody is on board with these projects. So, you know, if we have a consensus amongst a watershed in the community there, you have an opportunity to construct this without getting everybody on board. It allows for appropriate cost sharing, meaning the people who are benefiting from it the most are also contributing towards it. So landowners downstream who are now seeing less water go through their property on an overland state during these larger events will be financially contributing to this. And it's nice because constantly we hear owners downstream saying they are experiencing more water across their property. Well, here's an opportunity for you to, you know, put money towards solving that solution. We get a grant through a MAPRA when we construct these, which is, you know, certainly helps with selling these to landowners. They have a legal standing and it protects them. So if the property changes hands in the future, if you have a WASCoB upstream of your property protecting your property, that berm or that basin is going to remain intact because it now has legal standing and it is under the township's responsibility to maintain that. They do require landowner cooperation. You know, we're our facilitators under the Drainage Act. We designed a system that, you know, the landowners agree to. So if they do not want this system, you know, it's not our judgment to push this on landowners, but I am finding a lot of cooperation. There's certainly people experiencing erosion. They're certainly seeing the benefits. They understand what we're trying to suggest to them. And I would say we have very good uptake, definitely greater than 50% on the suggestion to incorporate these where we think it's appropriate. It's not a solution for all watersheds. You have to have, you know, enough natural grade to have the topography, but not only do you have to have grade going downhill, you also have to have grade where it rises to the side. So if that's perpendicular to the flow of the water, because you need to be able to construct a berm to restrict the flow. If the topography is too flat, perpendicular to the surface flow, then you tend to not be able to create a cost-effective, efficient berm to control the surface flow. So you need the right topography in both along the route of the drain, and also perpendicular to the route of the drain. And you need enough grade too. If areas are too flat, they aren't good candidates for this because you can't control the water enough with the berms. From, you know, our perspective, when we receive these projects, we have an established watershed typically, but we obtain topographical information for the watershed. This includes infield water surveying. Fortunately, a lot of the conservation authorities in this area, we have LiDAR data for now, which we've found is quite accurate for this kind of work. We establish the overland flow routes, so we identify the best locations where WASCoBs can be implemented. You know, the biggest things we're looking at for design criteria are, you know, how cost effectively can we construct this, the least amount of restriction to the landowners using the land, and also natural locations where they make sense. Typically, we're trying to design these WASCoBs to have a tributary area between 5 to 10 hectares. So, you know, if you had a 20-hectare parcel, we would be looking to have approximately 3 WASCoB berms across that parcel. And we analyze the watershed and the tributary areas to determine the required storage. You know, every land use and topography has a different amount of storage that's required. You have lighter soils, or you have, better maintained soils, where you're not having the same volumes of runoff as other watersheds. When we have, these heavier soils or soils in poor conditions, we're starting to see more runoff, or steeper slopes, more runoff. So we need to store more of that water. Below I've kind of shown an example of how we lay one out. Here you can see the contours of all the different intervals running across here. And then we've shown in this light cyan blue line here, the WASCoB we would be designing, that these blue lines here show this amount of water that they would retain at the different contour levels. So that would have that kind of system. And then we'd have an inlet that would be typically a Hickenbottom, sometimes a blind inlet, that would be connected into the green here represents the municipal drain tile that runs through that farm. Again, you can see there's lots of fall perpendicular to the drain, so that allows us to create a very narrow berm there and still store lots of water upstream. This is kind of typically what we're publishing recently under the Drainage Act on reports and plans. You can see, we have a couple details here showing different berms. Here's a grass berm. We can see the existing flow patterns going through there, and we have a new municipal drain tile that goes across there. So what we've done is created a berm across there, cut that flow off and push it into the inlet here. Off to the side, here's another example of one. This is a combination of one that's workable and non-workable with a grass berm here. So in the situation where you might have the natural waters going 45 degrees to the working direction of the field, then we've created a combination berm. You have the workable portion, which allows them to continue to work their field without interfering with the cropping operation. But we also have the grass berm, which again, that's about cost effectiveness and overall less maintenance associated with that. Here's a watershed that is in St. Clair Region Conservation Authority where we're proposing. You can see here's the watershed of the drain here, and we've shown a WASCoB berm to be designed just downstream of the road here, then one here, another 3 across here, and then another couple upstream. Again, we've been able to place most of these strategically. You can see 3 here and 1 across the Bushwood lot limits here. So you got 4 out of these 6 WASCoBs in this area that are all placed at strategic locations that aren't interfering with the cropping operations. And then the 2 that are remaining are in the direction of cropping, so they're not causing too much interference. Our feedback and our discussion with the owners, it's been mostly positive. We're seeing a bit of pushback from upstream landowners who are contributing towards these, but not currently experiencing active or concerning erosion. They're not seeing the large soil movement on their property. So there's a little bit of hesitancy there for them to contribute. But for owners who own enough land and they have downstream properties, they understand. So it's hit or miss with upstream landowners. I find a lot of complaints are more about workability, maintenance, potential failures. There's not, other than some upstream landowners, there's not a whole lot of pushback about cost between granting and cost sharing. It seems like that's not been the primary concern. Some of the concern is the farmers saying to me they're concerned about this failing. We haven't had any fail yet to date. Occasionally where we've implemented WASCoB berms, we've also had farmers ask for increased design, or rather we've implemented WASCoBs because farmers have asked for increased design. So where farmers are asking for a bigger tile, we've said, putting in a bigger tile is not fair to the downstream landowners. What we can do as a compromise is we'll put in WASCoBs and the larger tile. Therefore, they're getting a larger level of service during a very common rain event, but during a very large rain event, the downstream owners are protected from the additional surging that would be occurring. So it's a nice compromise. It's a great solution because it's allowing large storms to be retained and decreasing the amount of damage they do, while still providing that high level of drainage service to the landowners and farmers. The road departments have had a little bit of concerns about them. Sometimes, you know, if they get too close to the roads, they're backing up with water towards the roads. And unfortunately, you know, where we're trying to place them in natural locations like property lines that often is near roadways. So there's been a little bit of negative feedback from roads, but roads are concerned about drainage, not erosion. So it would make sense. So from a construction standpoint, you know, they're economical to construct because they're all made out of on-site material. I have a photo in the bottom right there of one we constructed. You know, it's mostly just excavator time and dozer time. You know, getting enough compaction on these for immediate can be a difficult balance. You know, we're trying to be cost effective about these. You know, you're not packing it in very small lifts like you would with a road base, but you're also you're trying to construct them quickly enough that you're not running the bill up, but also with enough compaction that they're going to hold up. You know, until grass is established on them, they are susceptible to washing. We have had a little bit of experience with that happening, but it's no different than establishing a grass waterway or other erosion solutions where we've seen where we have these bare soil conditions. Vertical standpipe inlets like a Hickenbottom shown, they need to be cleaned out from debris, especially sometimes we'll have debris from farming practices washing up to them. Blind inlets we're seeing installed a lot of the time, which are great, but they do require more frequent maintenance. I guess a downside from our perspective is that, you know, they require more supervision, both in a construction and from the municipality standpoint in the future, to ensure they're A, constructed correctly, and B, continue to function properly. You know, and that's got to be a combination of the municipality ensuring they're maintaining, but also the farmers who have these on their property being aware of what they should be doing and how they should be functioning, and then talking to the township if they think they aren't functioning correctly. If there's a sufficient number of WASCoBs, we've been making it so that the overland flows go around the edges of the WASCoBs because it's a longer flow path, meaning the slopes are gentler. But if there isn't a sufficient amount of WASCoBs, meaning we have WASCoBs in the downstream properties of the drain, but not the upstream, we've actually been constructing overflow chutes, typically synthetic, but occasionally out of stone, to control the overflow when the WASCoBs can't handle the storms. You know, if we can't get these WASCoBs on the upstream properties, then there's no way we can handle, you know, a 10 or a 25-year storm event. They're going to be more like a 1 or 2 year storm event, and they're going to be expected to overflow at times. Years later, unfortunately, we don't have a ton of long-term data on these yet. We've been completing these for about 10 years, but the majority, the bulk of the projects have been completed in the last few years. We have a couple that are older. One is 10 years old that we constructed, and it's holding up extremely well. It has a significant amount of topsoil now that can be salvaged. If I had to guess, in the neighborhood of 30 to 40 centimeters or 12 to 16 inches of topsoil over a very large area. The turf has held up well, and we'll continue to monitor in the future, but we have no failures reported to date other than a little bit of washing that's been occurring during construction. Some landowners have been constructing WASCoBs on their properties themselves. You know, if you're going to consider this as an owner, we encourage you to talk to the Conservation Authority. There may be permits and stuff required to complete the work, but it's and they might be able to point you in the direction of an expert to help get you some advice on, practical approaches to this, whether that's OMAFRA staff, in-house staff with them, an engineer, or OMAFRA certified erosion control contractors. They will be able to help you. I encourage you to reach out to them. If landowners have equipment, this is a very cost-effective manner to help with erosion on their property. I have a couple landowners who have hundreds or thousands of acres who are actively trying to construct these on the majority of their property because they're seeing huge benefits from these. They're keeping their topsoil, they're seeing better yields, less erosion, and I think a big thing too, while no-till is helping with erosion, because you're not tilling fresh topsoil into that spot that's eroding, we're starting to see gullies form more so than we have historically, and farmers are becoming much more aware of that. It's when farmers do them themselves, they're a little less technical, but they're still a great benefit to the watershed. They don't typically hold up the same level of design that from a flooding perspective that we would be, but they still are having the same, soil movement benefits that we would expect from ours. There's a whole bunch of different design resources available to people looking into these structures. Ontario Publication 832 by OMAFRA, there's Agricultural Erosion Control Structures, talks about detailed design of these structures. It's quite technical though. There's drainage reports and plans which identify watersheds and tributary areas, for the bulk of southwestern Ontario. There's LIDAR data available. I've shown, the areas where we have active LIDAR data, which is extremely useful resource. There's modeling softwares that are very efficient for modeling this type of stuff. Technical Release 55 by the US Department of Agriculture has useful information. And then we have soil maps from all the counties, which all come together to make these very, very efficient and convenient to design.
I'm going to have to, sorry to cut you off there.
No problem. Sorry, Jessica.
No worries. That was wonderful. I think you laid out the whole process quite nicely. That was a really great presentation. In the interest of time, we do need to move on. But I did have one question as we get Craig Merkley loaded up with his presentation. Either you can tell us quickly or you can put it in the chat. Ideally, how long should a WASCoB last, and what could a landowner do to properly maintain them?
Yeah, so it depends on how much soil movement's occurring on your property. I would say from our experience, around the 10-year mark, you're going to see the topsoil be at a point where it needs to be salvaged. The blind inlets would probably, at a 5 to 10-year interval, probably need to be cleared off, and a little bit of reconstruction there. As far as hick and bottoms, we've seen them go a very long time without need for maintenance, but their effectiveness is going to be reduced as time goes on. But the benefit is that you get a sufficient amount, well, not a sufficient, a large amount of topsoil salvaged from these, which can now either be reused or redistributed. It's not as painful as doing other maintenance where you're just buying materials. You're actually getting a material you can use out of completing this maintenance. So, yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much.